Laramie, Wyoming Territory, 1877. The dust from the stagecoach settled across Main Street like a filmy veil, coating everything in a fine layer of grit. 25-year-old Heath Donovan squinted against the afternoon sun as the vehicle lurched to a stop outside the Territorial Bank. He adjusted his Stetson, the leather worn but well-maintained, and leaned against the hitching post outside the general store. The town of Laramie was growing faster than most, the Union Pacific having brought prosperity and no shortage of newcomers to the once quiet frontier outpost. Heath had been riding for the Double R Ranch for 3 seasons now, and had earned enough respect to be sent into town on important errands for his boss. But respect didn't equal belonging, not in Heath's mind. A cowboy's life was temporary by nature, transient, solitary. The vast Wyoming plains had taught him one undeniable truth. Attachments were dangerous in a land where death waited around every corner. A man survived by keeping to himself and trusting no one but his horse and his colt. "Stagecoach is running late again," remarked Tobias, the aging shopkeeper who'd stepped out to sweep his boardwalk. "Must be bringing in somebody important." Heath merely nodded. He wasn't one for idle chatter. The bank draft in his pocket needed delivering to Mr. Rutherford, and then he'd be back in the saddle where he belonged. The open range made sense to him in ways town never would. No expectations, no complications, just man against nature the way it was supposed to be. The stagecoach door swung open, and a young woman emerged, her light blue traveling dress catching the breeze as she stepped down. Heath found himself unable to look away. She was perhaps 20 years old, with golden blonde hair tucked partially beneath a modest bonnet, though errant curls had escaped to frame her face. Her complexion was fair but sun-kissed, suggesting she wasn't entirely unaccustomed to the outdoors. The porter handed down a single trunk and a smaller leather valise. "Is this truly Laramie?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of Eastern refinement but lacking the haughty tone Heath had come to expect from city folk. "Yes, ma'am," the driver confirmed. "End of the line for this coach." The woman looked around with wide blue eyes, taking in the dusty Main Street with its wooden buildings and the distant snow-capped mountains. Something in her expression, a mixture of determination and trepidation, caught Heath's attention. She didn't belong here, that much was obvious. Yet unlike most Eastern transplants, she didn't seem disgusted by her surroundings merely. Overwhelmed, as Heath watched, she squared her shoulders and approached the hotel across the street, only to be stopped by the sight of a weathered sign in the window, "No vacancies." "Excuse me," she called to the driver, who was already loading mail sacks for the return journey. "Is there another hotel in town?" The driver shook his head. "Railroad crews took every room in Laramie, miss. Won't be any vacancies for weeks." A flicker of panic crossed her delicate features before she composed herself. "I see. Is there perhaps a boarding house where a lady might—" "You'd need references for Mrs. Wilson's place," interrupted a woman passing by, her voice not unkind but matter of fact. "She doesn't take just anyone." Heath found himself watching the scene with unusual interest. The young woman stood beside her trunk, looking suddenly lost. He recognized that look, had seen it in his own reflection years ago when he'd first arrived out west. The frontier had a way of stripping away pretenses and leaving people raw and exposed. "I have a letter," the blonde woman said, fumbling in her reticule to produce an envelope, "for Mr. Bernard Bailey. I was told he operates the mercantile here." Several townspeople within earshot exchanged glances. Heath straightened, his errand momentarily forgotten. "Bernie Bailey passed 6 months ago, miss," Tobias said gently. "Influenza took him quick-like." The woman's face drained of color. "That cannot be. I received correspondence from him just 8 weeks ago inviting me to—" She stopped abruptly, seeming to realize she was drawing attention. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake," said a burly man exiting the saloon. "Old Bailey's been planted since February. Whoever wrote to you was playing games." Heath recognized the man as Frank Tillman, who'd bought Bailey's store after his passing. Something unpleasant lurked in Tillman's expression as he approached the young woman. "I'm Frank Tillman. I own Bailey's mercantile now, and you are?" "Beatrice Bailey," she replied, her voice steady despite her evident distress. "Bernard Bailey was my uncle. I've come to assist him with the store at his request." A ripple of murmurs spread through the growing crowd of onlookers. Heath remained motionless, but his attention was fixed on the unfolding scene. "Well now," Tillman said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's mighty interesting, considering Bernie never mentioned any niece to anyone in town, and he sold me that store fair and square before he took sick." "That's impossible," Beatrice insisted. "My uncle wrote that he needed help managing the business due to his advancing age. I left my position as a teacher in Boston to come west." Tillman's laugh was echoed by several men loitering nearby. "Looks like someone's been spinning you tales, Miss Bailey, if that's really your name." "I assure you I am Beatrice Bailey. I have documentation." She reached again for her reticule. "Documents can be forged," interrupted Tillman. "Wouldn't be the first time some woman tried to claim relation to a dead man to get her hands on his property." Beatrice's cheeks flushed with color. "I am no con artist, sir. I am Bernard Bailey's brother's daughter, come at his explicit invitation." "Brother?" A woman in the crowd scoffed. Bernie Bailey was an only child, everyone knows that. The laughter grew louder. Beatrice stood rigid, clutching her valise, as jeers and whispers surrounded her. "Convenient that you'd show up after he's dead and can't contradict your story. Fancy dress don't make you kin, honey. What's the real scheme, city girl?" Heath had seen enough. Something about the young woman's dignified bearing in the face of mockery stirred something inside him. Before he could consider the wisdom of his actions, he pushed away from the hitching post and strode into the center of the gathering. "That's enough," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the hard edge that made even the rowdiest cowboys at the Double R take notice. The crowd quieted, turning to look at the young cowboy. At 25, Heath wasn't the oldest or most established man in Laramie, but his reputation for straight dealing and his quick draw had earned him a certain respect. "Miss Bailey," Heath said, tipping his hat to Beatrice. "I believe my employer, Mr. Rutherford, was acquainted with your uncle. He mentioned expecting Bernard's niece from back east." The lie slipped easily from his lips, surprising even himself. Beatrice looked at him with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. "Heath Donovan," he introduced himself. "I ride for the Double R. If you'll permit me, I'd be happy to escort you to the ranch. Mrs. Rutherford would welcome the company of another lady, I'm sure." "Now see here, Donovan," Tillman began, his face darkening. "This doesn't concern you or the Rutherfords." "Seems it does," Heath replied calmly, "especially since Mr. Rutherford was witness to Bailey's will. I reckon he'd have something to say about the legitimacy of certain property transfers." This, at least, wasn't entirely fabrication. Heath had overheard his boss discussing Bailey's estate with the town lawyer months ago. There had been questions about the rapid sale of the mercantile to Tillman. Tillman's face reddened. "You're overstepping, cowboy." Heath ignored him, focusing on Beatrice. "Miss Bailey, if you'd like to lodge a formal inquiry about your uncle's affairs, Mr. Rutherford would be glad to assist. In the meantime, the ranch can offer you proper accommodations until matters are settled." He was going beyond his authority, and he knew it. Mr. Rutherford might not appreciate Heath volunteering his hospitality, but something about the look in Beatrice's eyes, that mixture of fear and determination, compelled him to action. The crowd had fallen silent, watching the confrontation with interest. Everyone in Laramie knew Frank Tillman had powerful friends and a mean streak. Heath was risking more than just his job. "I would be most grateful, Mr. Donovan," Beatrice finally said, her voice soft but resolute, "though I wouldn't wish to impose upon your employer's generosity." "No imposition," Heath assured her, extending his hand toward her trunk. "May I?" As he lifted her trunk onto his shoulder, a strange sensation washed over him, as though by this simple act he'd altered the course of his carefully isolated existence. The weight of the young woman's belongings was nothing compared to the weight of what he'd just done, publicly aligning himself with a stranger against one of the most influential men in town. "This isn't over, Donovan," Tillman growled as Heath helped Beatrice onto his wagon, which was hitched nearby. Heath merely nodded, his face impassive despite the concern churning inside him. He'd just broken his own cardinal rule of frontier survival: never get involved in other people's troubles. Yet something about Beatrice Bailey made him think that perhaps some troubles were worth facing head-on. As they rode out of town, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the trail, Heath kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. Beside him, Beatrice sat straight-backed and silent, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He could feel her gaze on him occasionally, curious and cautious. "Why did you help me back there, mister Donovan?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible over the creak of wagon wheels. Heath considered his answer carefully. "Sometimes doing right doesn't need a reason, Miss Bailey." But even as he spoke the words, Heath knew they weren't entirely true. There had been something in her quiet dignity that had called to him, something that challenged his belief that the frontier was no place for connections. And now, for better or worse, their fates had become intertwined on the dusty streets of Laramie. The Double R Ranch sprawled across the foothills of the Medicine Bow Mountains, its main house visible from miles away, a testament to Jacob Rutherford's prosperity and vision. As Heath guided the wagon up the long drive, he could sense Beatrice's growing apprehension. "Mr. Donovan," she said softly, "I feel I must confess something." Heath tensed, wondering if Tillman had been right about her after all. "I truly am Bernard Bailey's niece," she continued, "but our correspondence was limited. I cannot be certain the invitation I received was genuine, or if perhaps someone was using his name after his passing." She twisted her gloved hands in her lap. "My situation in Boston had become untenable. The letter offering me a position and family connection here seemed providence." Heath studied her profile, noting the worry line between her brows. "What kind of untenable?" Beatrice hesitated. "I was a governess for a prominent family. The master of the house made improper advances. When I refused him, he ensured I was dismissed without references. No respectable household would employ me after that." A surge of anger rose in Heath's chest, surprising him with its intensity. "So you came west?" She nodded. "The letter arrived just when I had exhausted my savings. It seemed like divine intervention, an uncle I barely knew offering sanctuary and purpose. I should have been more cautious, but desperation clouds judgment." Heath absorbed this, turning it over in his mind. "Your uncle was a good man. Quiet-like but respected. I don't know if he sent for you or not, but I do know Frank Tillman took over that store mighty quick after Bailey fell ill. Folks wondered about it." "Do you believe me then?" she asked, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. Heath held her gaze. "I do, but believing and proving are different matters out here." The wagon crested the final rise, revealing the full spread of the Double R, bunkhouses, barns, corrals, and the two-story main house with its wide porch. Several cowboys paused in their evening chores to watch the wagon approach. "Mr. Donovan," Beatrice said urgently, placing her hand lightly on his arm, "I have no wish to create difficulty between you and your employer." "Perhaps this was a mistake." Heath called a booming voice as they pulled up to the house. Jacob Rutherford descended the porch steps, his silver hair gleaming in the fading light. "Wasn't expecting you back with company." Heath set the brake and jumped down from the wagon. "Mr. Rutherford, sir, this is Miss Beatrice Bailey, Bernard Bailey's niece from Boston." Rutherford's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Bailey's niece. Well, I'll be." "There seems to be some confusion in town regarding her uncle's affairs," Heath continued carefully. "Frank Tillman claims rightful ownership of the mercantile, but Miss Bailey received correspondence from her uncle inviting her west to help run the business." Rutherford's weathered face grew serious as he studied Beatrice, who had remained seated in the wagon, her back straight as a ramrod. "Is that so?" he said finally. "Well, Miss Bailey, any kin of Bernie's is welcome at the Double R. Martha," he called toward the house. "We've got a guest." Relief washed over Heath as Mrs. Rutherford appeared, a plump, cheerful woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. If anyone could make Beatrice feel welcome, it was Martha Rutherford. "Bernard Bailey's niece, you say?" Mrs. Rutherford exclaimed, hurrying down the steps. "Why, he spoke of you sometimes. Said his brother had a daughter back east who was sharp as a tack. Come in, come in. You must be exhausted after that dreadful stagecoach ride." As Martha ushered a visibly stunned Beatrice toward the house, Heath found himself facing his employer's scrutinizing gaze. "Interesting development," Rutherford said quietly, "especially since I recall Bernie telling me his brother died childless years ago." Heath's stomach tightened. "Sir, Rutherford held up a hand. "I'm not accusing the girl of lying. Bernard had a half-brother from his father's first marriage. Few folks around here knew about him. The question is, how did Tillman know to move so quickly after Bernie took sick?" And why is he so bothered by this young lady's arrival? You think there's something fishy about how Tillman acquired the mercantile, Heath said, realization dawning. I know there is, Rutherford confirmed. I just haven't had proof. Until now, perhaps. He glanced toward the house, where Beatrice was disappearing inside with Mrs. Rutherford. That young lady might be exactly what we need to uncover the truth. Heath frowned. She's not bait, sir. Rutherford studied his young cowhand with interest. No, she's not, but she might be justice. He clapped Heath on the shoulder. You did right bringing her here, son. Though I suspect your reasons weren't entirely about justice. Heath felt heat creep up his neck. Just seemed the proper thing to do. Indeed, Rutherford said with a knowing smile. Get the wagon unloaded and then join us for supper. I expect Miss Bailey will have quite a story to tell. As Heath lifted Beatrice's trunk from the wagon bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd set something significant in motion. Something that threatened the careful isolation he'd maintained since arriving in Wyoming Territory 3 years earlier. The young woman with the golden hair and determined blue eyes had awakened something inside him that he'd thought long buried, the dangerous desire to connect. Supper at the Rutherford table was unlike anything Beatrice had experienced since leaving Boston. The fare was simple but abundant: roast beef, potatoes, fresh-baked bread, and apple pie for dessert. Mrs. Rutherford kept urging second helpings upon her while Mr. Rutherford asked gentle but probing questions about her uncle and their correspondence. Heath sat quietly, speaking only when addressed directly. Yet Beatrice was acutely aware of his presence at the far end of the table, his gaze occasionally meeting hers when the conversation turned to events in town. So the last letter you received was dated when? Rutherford asked, leaning forward with interest. March 15th, Beatrice replied. It arrived in Boston on April 2nd. I departed on the 10th and have been traveling since. March 15th, Rutherford repeated thoughtfully. That's nearly 6 weeks after Bernie died. A chill ran through Beatrice. Then someone else wrote to me using his name. But who would do such a thing, and why? That's what we aim to find out, Rutherford said firmly. I was executor of your uncle's will, Miss Bailey. There were irregularities in how his affairs were handled after his passing. Frank Tillman produced a bill of sale dated just 2 days before Bernie took ill, but I never saw Bernie sign it. You think it was forged? Heath spoke up, his deep voice drawing everyone's attention. I had my suspicions, Rutherford confirmed. But without evidence, there wasn't much I could do. Judge Preston is friendly with Tillman, too friendly if you ask me. Mrs. Rutherford reached across to pat Beatrice's hand. What matters now is that you're here and safe, dear. We'll sort this out. I'm most grateful for your kindness, Beatrice said softly, but I don't wish to cause trouble. Perhaps I should continue on to Denver, where I might find employment. Nonsense, declared Mrs. Rutherford. If Bernard Bailey was your uncle, then his property should rightfully pass to you as his next of kin. We'll see justice done. Beatrice glanced at Heath, whose expression had grown thoughtful. Mr. Donovan, you risked much by intervening today. I fear Mr. Tillman may cause difficulties for you. A ghost of a smile touched Heath's lips. Wouldn't be the first time I've had difficulties, Miss Bailey. Heath can handle himself, Rutherford assured her. Best hand with a horse I've ever employed, and not too shabby with a 6-shooter either. Still, Beatrice persisted, I would not wish anyone to suffer on my account. Heath's hazel eyes met hers directly. Some things are worth suffering for, Miss Bailey. The simple statement, delivered without flourish, caused a peculiar warmth to spread through Beatrice's chest. This young cowboy, with his quiet strength and unexpected gallantry, defied her preconceptions of Western men. Well, Mrs. Rutherford said, rising from the table, it's been a long day for all of us. Heath, would you be so kind as to bring Miss Bailey's trunk up to the blue room? I've had Sally air it out. As Heath excused himself to fetch her belongings, Beatrice found herself watching him go, his tall, lean frame moving with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. For the first time since receiving that fateful letter in Boston, she wondered if perhaps coming west hadn't been a terrible mistake after all. The following days settled into an unexpected rhythm. Beatrice rose early, assisting Mrs. Rutherford with household tasks, while Mr. Rutherford made inquiries in town regarding her uncle's affairs. Heath came and went, attending to ranch business but invariably appearing at mealtimes, quiet but attentive. Beatrice found herself watching for him, her heart quickening whenever he entered a room. She told herself it was merely gratitude for his intervention, but in honest moments, she recognized a deeper attraction brewing. There was something compelling about his reserved manner and thoughtful observations. Unlike the polished gentleman of Boston, Heath Donovan's words carried weight precisely because they were few. On her fourth morning at the Double R, Beatrice was gathering eggs in the henhouse when Heath appeared in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the early light. "Miss Bailey," he said, removing his hat. "Mr. Rutherford asked if I'd show you the property today, said you might appreciate some fresh air." Beatrice straightened, basket in hand. "That would be lovely, Mr. Donovan. Though I wouldn't wish to keep you from your duties." "This is my duty today," he replied simply. "I've saddled a gentle mare for you. Do you ride?" "I had lessons as a girl," she admitted, "though it's been some years." Heath nodded. "Daisy's patient, she'll treat you right." An hour later, they crested a ridge overlooking the sprawling ranch. The spring grass was emerging in vibrant green patches, and wildflowers dotted the hillsides. Beatrice felt a freedom she'd never known in Boston's confines, the open sky stretching endlessly above her. "It's beautiful," she breathed, reining Daisy to a stop beside Heath's stallion. "It is," he agreed, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Different kind of beautiful than what you're used to, I expect." "Yes, but perhaps more honest." The words slipped out before she could consider them. "I mean, the landscape hides nothing. It simply is what it is, without pretense." Heath regarded her with newfound interest. "That's a fair assessment. The land doesn't lie, neither does a good horse. It's people that complicate matters." "Like Mr. Tillman," Beatrice suggested. "Among others." Heath shifted in his saddle, gesturing toward the distant mountains. "There's a creek over that next rise, good spot to rest the horses." They rode in companionable silence until reaching the creek, where they dismounted. Heath spread his coat on a flat rock for Beatrice to sit upon, then led the horses to drink. "Mr. Rutherford believes he's found something," he said as he rejoined her. "Something about your uncle's will." Beatrice looked up sharply. "What did he discover?" "The original will is missing from the county records. Only a copy exists, one that Tillman provided after your uncle's death." Heath settled beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Mr. Rutherford remembers the original specified that in the absence of direct heirs, the store would go to any living relatives. It said nothing about a sale to Tillman." "Then the bill of sale was indeed forged," Beatrice concluded. "Seems likely. But proving it is another matter." Heath plucked a stem of grass, twirling it between his fingers. "Tillman's been asking questions about you in town, spreading rumors." Beatrice stiffened. "What kind of rumors?" Heath's jaw tightened. "Nothing worth repeating, but folks are curious about why you're staying at the Double R instead of trying to claim your uncle's property." "I have nowhere else to go," she said quietly, "and no means to challenge Mr. Tillman legally." "You have the Rutherfords," Heath reminded her, "and you have me." The simple declaration hung in the air between them. Beatrice studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the fan of dark lashes against tanned skin. At 25, Heath Donovan carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen hardship and survived it. "Why do you care what happens to me, Mr. Donovan? You don't know me." Heath was silent for a long moment. "I know what it's like to arrive somewhere with nothing but hope, only to have that hope challenged." He met her gaze directly. 3 years ago, I stepped off a train in Cheyenne with $10 in my pocket and nightmares that wouldn't let me sleep. The war had been over for years, but not in my head. "You fought in the war between the states?" Beatrice asked softly. "Enlisted at 17, saw things no boy should see." His voice was matter-of-fact without self-pity. "When I came west, I figured I'd keep to myself, safer that way. No attachments meant nothing to lose." And now, Beatrice found herself holding her breath, though she couldn't have explained why his answer mattered so much. Heath's eyes held hers. "Now I'm not so sure that's the right way to live." The confession, simple as it was, shifted something between them. Beatrice felt as though a door had opened, allowing a glimpse into the carefully guarded thoughts of this enigmatic cowboy. "I understand isolation," she offered. After my parents died, I had no family except a distant cousin who arranged my employment as a governess. I was always adjacent to family life, but never truly part of it. When I received what I thought was my uncle's letter, offering both kinship and purpose, she trailed off, emotion tightening her throat. You grabbed onto it like a drowning person, Heath finished for her. Beatrice nodded, surprised by his perception. Yes, exactly so. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the gurgle of the creek and the occasional stamp of the horse's hooves. Beatrice found herself relaxing in Heath's company in a way she hadn't with anyone in years. There was something steadying about his presence, a dependability that made her feel secure despite the uncertainty of her situation. We should head back, Heath said eventually, rising to his feet and extending his hand to help her up. Storm clouds building to the west. As his calloused hand closed around hers, Beatrice felt a jolt of awareness race up her arm. Their eyes met, and for a breathless moment, neither moved. Then Heath gently released her hand and turned to collect the horses. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Yet Beatrice sensed a shift in their relationship, a tentative connection forming despite the barriers Heath had built around himself. She found herself wondering what it might be like to breach those walls completely, to discover the man behind the careful reserve. As they approached the ranch, a rider came galloping toward them. Beatrice recognized one of the double R hands, his expression urgent. Heath, Mr. Rutherford sent me to find you. There's trouble in town. Tillman's filed a complaint with the sheriff, accusing Miss Bailey of fraud and the Rutherfords of harboring a criminal. Heath's expression hardened. On what grounds? Claims he's got proof she ain't who she says she is. Sheriff's given her until sundown tomorrow to present herself for questioning, or he'll come out to the ranch. Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. This is absurd. I am Bernard Bailey's niece. Tillman says he's got a telegram from Boston proving otherwise. The cowhand shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Mr. Rutherford's gone to speak with Judge Preston, but Preston and Tillman are thick as thieves, Heath finished grimly. All right, tell Mr. Rutherford we're coming in. As the cowhand galloped away, Beatrice turned to Heath, fear evident in her eyes. What if they arrest me? I have no way to prove my identity except my uncle's letters. They won't arrest you, Heath said with quiet confidence. Not while I'm around. The simple declaration should have seemed presumptuous from a young cowboy with no legal authority. Instead, Beatrice found it profoundly reassuring. In the few days she'd known him, Heath Donovan had demonstrated an unwavering integrity that made his words feel like a promise. Thank you, she said softly. Heath's eyes met hers and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that whatever came next, they would face it together. The realization should have frightened Beatrice, this sudden dependence on a man she barely knew. Instead, it felt like finding solid ground after months of uncertainty. As they rode toward the ranch house, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, mirroring the storm that awaited them in Laramie. The following morning dawned gray and threatening, low clouds scudding across the Wyoming sky as Heath helped Beatrice into the Rutherford's carriage. Mrs. Rutherford had insisted on accompanying them to town, her normally cheerful face set in determined lines. No young lady should face such nonsense without proper female company, she declared, settling her ample form on the seat beside Beatrice. Besides, I've known Sheriff Collins since he was in short pants. He won't be bullied by Frank Tillman while I'm present. Heath mounted his stallion to ride alongside the carriage, his Winchester rifle secured in its scabbard. He'd said little since receiving the news of Tillman's accusation, but Beatrice had noticed him checking his revolver and speaking in low tones with Mr. Rutherford late into the evening. The journey to town passed in tense silence. Beatrice clutched her reticule, which contained her uncle's letters and what few personal documents she possessed. Would they be enough to prove her identity? And what proof did Tillman claim to have against her? As they approached Laramie, Beatrice was startled to see a larger-than-usual number of people moving about the main street for a weekday morning. Word of the confrontation had clearly spread. Vultures, Mrs. Rutherford muttered, noting the crowd. Nothing folks love more than a spectacle. Heath guided them to the sheriff's office, his expression impassive but his eyes constantly scanning the onlookers. As he helped Beatrice down from the carriage, his hand lingered on hers. Remember, he said quietly, you've done nothing wrong. Hold your head high. Drawing strength from his steady gaze, Beatrice straightened her shoulders and turned toward the sheriff's office. Before they could enter, however, Frank Tillman emerged from the building, flanked by several men including one wearing a badge. "Well, well," Tillman called, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "The supposed niece has decided to grace us with her presence, and with quite the escort, I see." Sheriff Collins, a weathered man with a drooping mustache, stepped forward. "Miss Bailey, I presume. I'm Sheriff Collins. I appreciate you coming in voluntarily to address these concerns." "What concerns exactly, Sheriff?" Mrs. Rutherford demanded before Beatrice could respond. "This young lady is Bernard Bailey's niece, come to Wyoming at his invitation. What possible crime has been committed?" "That's what we aim to determine, Mrs. Rutherford," the sheriff replied evenly. "Mr. Tillman has raised some serious questions about the young lady's identity and intentions." "Has he indeed?" Mrs. Rutherford's voice dripped with disdain. "And since when does Frank Tillman determine who is welcome in Laramie?" Tillman stepped forward, a telegram clutched in his hand. "Since I received this from the Boston Police Department yesterday. Seems they're quite interested in locating a young woman matching Miss Bailey's description who disappeared after stealing jewelry from her employers." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Beatrice felt her knees weaken, but Heath's steady presence beside her kept her upright. "That is an outrageous falsehood," she declared, her voice stronger than she felt. "I took nothing from the Harrington household except what was rightfully mine." "So you admit you worked for the Harringtons?" Tillman pounced, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "I was employed as governess to their children, yes," Beatrice confirmed, "but I resigned my position due to circumstances that made my continued employment untenable." "Circumstances," Tillman repeated mockingly, "or perhaps you were dismissed for theft." "Mr. Tillman," Heath's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd, "you seem remarkably well informed about Miss Bailey's previous employment for a man who claimed not to know her just days ago." A flicker of unease crossed Tillman's face before his sneer returned. "The telegraph is a remarkable invention, Donovan. It allows information to travel faster than lies." "Or to create them," Heath countered. "Curious that you'd go to such lengths to discredit a young woman whose only claim was to be Bernard Bailey's niece, unless you feared what her presence might reveal about how you acquired his business." The crowd's attention shifted, whispers breaking out as people considered this perspective. Tillman's face darkened. "Watch yourself, Cowboy, you're treading dangerous ground." "Sheriff Collins," Beatrice spoke up, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I have my uncle's letters inviting me to Laramie. I also have documentation of my identity and my employment history. What I do not have is any understanding of why Mr. Tillman would fabricate criminal accusations against me." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Miss, if there's a warrant from Boston—" "There isn't," came a new voice. Jacob Rutherford pushed through the crowd, a telegram in his hand. "Just received this from the Boston Police Department in response to my inquiry yesterday. They confirm no warrants or complaints exist against any Beatrice Bailey. They have, however, received multiple inquiries about her from Wyoming Territory in recent days." He handed the telegram to Sheriff Collins, who read it with a furrowed brow. "This directly contradicts your telegram, Tillman." "It's a forgery," Tillman blustered. "Rutherford is obviously conspiring with this woman." "To what end?" Rutherford challenged. "What possible motive would I have for supporting a fraudulent claim? I was Bernard Bailey's friend and the executor of his will, a will that strangely disappeared after his death, replaced by a copy that conveniently excluded any mention of his family back east." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Beatrice noticed several townspeople exchanging significant glances, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. "I have something else," Rutherford continued, producing a folded document from his coat. "This morning, Judge Hayward from Cheyenne arrived on the early train. As a neutral party, he agreed to examine the county records regarding Bernard Bailey's property. He found this, an original deed transfer that was never properly filed." Sheriff Collins accepted the document, scanning it with increasing concern. "This appears to be a deed transferring ownership of the mercantile to Bernard's brother's heirs in the event of his death. It's dated 2 months before Bailey passed." "That's impossible," Tillman shouted. "Bailey sold me that store." Did he? Rutherford asked mildly, because Judge Hayward also examined your bill of sale. The notary's stamp is from a notary who died 3 months before the document was supposedly signed. The crowd gasped. Tillman's face drained of color, his eyes darting around as if seeking escape. "This is all lies," he spluttered. "You're all conspiring against me." "No, Frank," said an elderly man, stepping forward from the crowd. "You conspired against Bernie Bailey when he was too sick to fight back. We all wondered how you got that store so quick." "And for such a low price," added another townsperson. Sheriff Collins' expression had grown increasingly severe. "Mr. Tillman, I believe you'd better come inside and explain yourself. These allegations of document forgery are serious matters." As two deputies moved toward Tillman, his hand suddenly darted to his coat, emerging with a revolver. The crowd scattered, women screaming as he pointed the weapon directly at Beatrice. "This is all your fault," he snarled. "If you just stayed in Boston where you belonged." The roar of a gunshot split the air. Tillman cried out, his weapon flying from his hand as Heath's bullet struck his wrist with surgical precision. In the next instant, Heath was between Beatrice and Tillman, his Colt still raised and steady. "That was your wrist," Heath said, his voice deadly calm. "The next one's your heart if you so much as look at her again." Deputies swarmed Tillman, restraining him despite his howls of pain and rage. Sheriff Collins approached Heath cautiously. "That was fine shooting, Donovan, but maybe holster that weapon now." Heath lowered his gun slowly, never taking his eyes off Tillman until the man was secured. Only then did he turn to Beatrice, who stood frozen in shock. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentling as he searched her face. Beatrice nodded, unable to speak past the knot of emotion in her throat. This quiet cowboy had just saved her life without hesitation, placing himself between her and certain death as naturally as breathing. "Miss Bailey," Sheriff Collins said, approaching her with hat in hand. "I owe you an apology for giving credence to these accusations. It seems Mr. Tillman has been engaged in serious criminal activity, including document forgery and now attempted murder." "What about my uncle's store?" Beatrice asked, finding her voice at last. "Based on the documents Mr. Rutherford has provided, it appears the mercantile should rightfully pass to you as Bernard Bailey's next of kin," the sheriff confirmed. "Of course, there will be legal proceedings, but your claim seems sound." The realization washed over Beatrice in a wave. She had come to Wyoming with nothing but hope and her uncle's letters, only to discover deception. Yet through that deception, she had found truth, and perhaps something even more precious in the steady gaze of the man beside her. "Heath," she whispered, turning to him as the crowd dispersed and Tillman was led away. "You risked your life for me." His eyes met hers, something unguarded in their depths. "Some things are worth the risk." In that moment, with the Wyoming sun breaking through the clouds above them, Beatrice Bailey understood that she had found not just her uncle's legacy, but perhaps her future as well. The weeks that followed brought remarkable changes to Beatrice's circumstances. Judge Hayward formally invalidated Tillman's claim to the mercantile and recognized Beatrice as Bernard Bailey's rightful heir. With the Rutherfords' guidance, she took ownership of the store, learning the business with determination despite occasional skepticism from some townspeople. Frank Tillman awaited trial in the Cheyenne jail, having been denied bail due to the severity of his crimes and an apparent attempt to flee jurisdiction. His fall from prominence revealed a web of fraudulent dealings that had victimized others beyond Bernard Bailey, earning Beatrice unexpected allies among those who had initially doubted her. Through it all, Heath Donovan remained a steady presence. Though his duties at the Double R kept him busy, he made time to ride into town regularly, often staying to help Beatrice with inventory or repairs to the store's aging structure. Their friendship deepened through these shared tasks, conversations flowing more easily as the barriers between them gradually lowered. One evening in late June, as they sat on the small porch behind the mercantile watching fireflies rise from the nearby creek bed, Beatrice found the courage to ask the question that had lingered since that fateful day on Main Street. "Why did you draw your weapon that day? You could have been killed." Heath was silent for a long moment, his profile illuminated by the fading light. "I told myself it was because it was the right thing to do," he finally said. "But that wasn't the whole truth." Beatrice waited, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. "The truth is," Heath continued, his voice low. The thought of anything happening to you was unbearable. I've spent 3 years keeping people at a distance, convinced that attachments only lead to pain. Then you arrived, and suddenly. Suddenly, she prompted when he fell silent. Heath turned to face her, vulnerability evident in his expression. Suddenly, isolation seemed like the greater risk. When Tillman pulled that gun, I didn't think, I just acted. Because losing you wasn't an option. Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. Heath. I know it's too soon, he said quickly. You're just getting established here, and I'm just a cowhand with little to offer except. Except your heart, Beatrice finished softly, reaching to touch his hand. That seems like rather a lot to me. His fingers intertwined with hers, warm and strong. Is it enough? More than enough, she whispered. When I came west, I was seeking safety and purpose. I never imagined I might find love as well. Heath's eyes widened at the word, hope dawning in their depths. Beatrice, are you saying? I'm saying that perhaps we both came to Wyoming seeking something different than what we found, she said, smiling through sudden tears. And perhaps what we found is infinitely better. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, a tentative exploration that deepened as Heath's arms encircled her. Beatrice felt something settle into place within her soul, a sense of rightness, of coming home after a long journey. When they finally parted, Heath rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Beatrice Bailey. I think I have since I first saw you standing in the dust of Main Street, refusing to be cowed by Tillman and his cronies. She laughed softly, and I love you, Heath Donovan. Though I must admit it took me slightly longer, perhaps until you placed yourself between me and a loaded gun. I'd do it again in a heartbeat, he said with absolute conviction. I'd rather you didn't have to, she countered, stroking his cheek. I've grown quite attached to you intact and uninjured. Their laughter mingled in the evening air, a promise of joy to come. By autumn, Bailey's mercantile was thriving under Beatrice's management. She had introduced books and educational supplies alongside the traditional inventory, creating a small lending library in one corner that quickly became popular with local families. The townspeople who had once laughed at her claims now sought her opinion on everything from fabric selection to literary recommendations. Heath continued his work at the Double R, but spent every free moment in town. The Rutherfords, far from objecting to his frequent absences, seemed delighted by the romance blooming between their young friend and the woman they had come to consider family. On a crisp October afternoon, as golden leaves drifted past the mercantile windows, Heath entered the store with unusual formality, having changed from his work clothes into his Sunday best. Beatrice looked up from her ledger, surprise giving way to pleasure at the sight of him. Heath, I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow. Some things can't wait, he replied, removing his hat as he approached the counter. The store was empty of other customers, the late afternoon lull providing a rare moment of privacy. Beatrice's heart quickened at the intensity in his gaze. What things? Heath took her hand in his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Beatrice, when I came west, I believed the frontier was no place for love, that a man had to keep to himself to survive out here. You proved me wrong, he drew a deep breath. You showed me that real strength comes from connection, not isolation. She felt tears prick her eyes as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. I spoke with Reverend Thompson this morning, Heath continued, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. He's agreed to marry us whenever you're ready, whether that's next week or next year, I'll wait. But I can't wait another day to ask you to be my wife. He opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl. It was my mother's, he explained. The only thing of value I brought with me from Tennessee. Heath, Beatrice whispered, tears flowing freely now. It's beautiful. Is that a yes? He asked, a smile tugging at his lips despite the vulnerability in his expression. Yes, she confirmed, laughing through her tears. 1,000 times yes. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, the bell above the door jingled. They turned to find Martha and Jacob Rutherford entering the store, followed by several other townspeople, including the Reverend Thompson himself. Did she say yes? Mrs. Rutherford demanded, practically vibrating with excitement. We've been waiting across the street for nearly an hour. Heath laughed, his arm sliding around Beatrice's waist. She did indeed. Cheers erupted as more people crowded into the store, news of the proposal having apparently spread throughout Laramie. Beatrice found herself surrounded by the very community that had once viewed her with suspicion, now offering heartfelt congratulations and advice for the young couple. "We thought we might have a small celebration," Mr. Rutherford explained, as several women produced baskets containing food and bottles of cider. "The whole town's been waiting for Heath to work up the courage to propose." "The whole town knew?" Beatrice asked, bemused. "Honey, he's been mooning over you for months," Mrs. Rutherford said with a wink. "Not that you were any better. The two of you were the only ones who didn't see what was plain as day to everyone else." As the impromptu engagement party filled the mercantile with laughter and conversation, Beatrice found herself momentarily overwhelmed by the turn her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had arrived in Laramie alone and uncertain, met with skepticism and hostility. Now she stood surrounded by friends, a successful business owner engaged to a man who had risked everything for her. "Penny for your thoughts," Heath murmured, appearing at her side with 2 glasses of cider. "I was just thinking about that first day," she admitted, accepting the glass, "when they laughed at me for claiming to be Bernard Bailey's niece. If you hadn't stood up for me then—" "Someone would have eventually," Heath said. "The truth has a way of coming out." "Perhaps," Beatrice acknowledged, "but it was you who stood up. You who claimed me as worth defending when everyone else saw an imposter." Heath's eyes softened as he gazed down at her. "Best decision I ever made." "Even though it led to gunfire and danger," she teased gently. "Even then," he confirmed. "Some treasures are worth fighting for, Beatrice Bailey, you taught me that." As he bent to kiss her amid the cheers of their friends and neighbors, Beatrice knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in this vast western landscape. Not just in the mercantile that bore her family name, but in the arms of a cowboy who had dared to reach beyond his isolation to claim love in the heart of the frontier. They were married on the first Sunday in November, with golden aspens framing the white clapboard church and the entire town in attendance. Beatrice wore a gown of ivory satin ordered specially from Denver, with Mrs. Rutherford's lace veil and a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers gathered by the ranch hands of the Double R. Heath, resplendent in a new suit, watched with wondering eyes as she walked down the aisle on Mr. Rutherford's arm. The love shining in his gaze melted away any lingering doubts Beatrice might have harbored about their swift courtship. Some connections, she had learned, transcended time, soul recognizing soul across the dusty divide of a Wyoming street. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Thompson, beaming at the couple before him. "We gather today to witness the union of 2 souls brought together by Providence and preserved through adversity. Their journey reminds us that even in the wilds of this territory, love finds a way to bloom." As they exchanged their vows, Beatrice thought of the remarkable path that had led her to this moment, from a desperate young woman fleeing Boston to the confident bride standing before her community. The frontier had not broken her, as she had once feared it might. Instead, it had revealed strength she never knew she possessed and a capacity for love she had nearly abandoned hope of finding. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," declared the Reverend. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Heath's kiss was tender yet possessive, a promise of the life they would build together. As they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Heath Donovan, Beatrice caught sight of her uncle's portrait hanging in the back of the church, placed there in memoriam after his passing. She liked to think he was watching, perhaps even responsible in some mysterious way for the chain of events that had brought her to Laramie and to Heath. The reception that followed at Bailey's mercantile, temporarily transformed with bunting and flowers, lasted well into the evening. The Rutherfords had insisted on providing everything, from the 3-tiered wedding cake to the fiddle player who had the floorboards creaking beneath dancing boots. As twilight descended, Heath led his bride away from the celebration to the small house behind the mercantile that they would call home. He had spent weeks renovating it, determined that Beatrice should have a proper dwelling rather than the Spartan rooms where her uncle had lived alone. "Welcome home, Mrs. Donovan," he said softly, lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Beatrice laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I've been living here for weeks, you know." "Not as my wife," he pointed out, setting her down in the parlor where a fire crackled in the hearth. "Not in a home we'll build together." She reached up to touch his face, marveling at the journey that had brought them both to this moment. From the moment you stood up for me in town, you've been building me a home, Heath. Not of wood and nails, but of courage and devotion. His eyes darkened with emotion as he drew her close. And you've given me a reason to put down roots after years of drifting. You are my home, Beatrice. Wherever you are. As their lips met in the golden firelight, Beatrice knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the frontier might yet bring, they would face them together. The cowboy who had learned to open his heart, and the woman who had found her courage in the vast Wyoming wilderness. Outside their window, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering Laramie in a blanket of pristine white, a clean slate upon which their shared story was just beginning to be written.